I've been investing in real estate for over 10 years. I've picked up over 1,000 doors and I've made over $10 million in real estate. So I bought real estate in nearly every possible strategy that you can possibly think of. And if you're serious about getting your first real estate deal this year, then this video will save you months of trial and error. I'm ranking the top strategies from S tier all the way down to the trash tier so that you know exactly what to use and what to avoid. One of the highest ranked picks will probably surprise you because almost nobody is talking about it. So here's the scoring model we're going to use. Each strategy gets a score between 1 to 5 across 5 different factors. The first one is speed to close. The second one is cash needed out of pocket, how much you need to put down to make this thing work. Number 3 is the approval friction. How hard is it to get the financing approved and to get the deal closed? Number 4 is beginner risk or complexity. The higher the complexity, the lower the score, meaning the harder it is to get things done. And number 5 is market viability. Does this work in today's marketplace for a beginner? And remember, this is a tier list for beginners to help you get started as a real estate investor. So anything that wins on speed, low amounts of cash, low friction, and is easy for a beginner to pull off causes a strategy to bubble up towards the top. So with that, let's begin. We have a tier board here and a whole list of strategies that I'm going to rank, and I'm going to mix purchase strategies along with financing strategies. So you'll notice here that I have Airbnb on the list, which could be bought via any number of financing strategies like seller financing or bank financing. And so I'll explain why I'm going to go through this ranking the way I do, and so you can follow my logic. Okay, first up, the traditional financing or the 20% down strategy. Where would I put this? I would put this in the trash category. I would also put traditional bank financing in there. And the reason why is because these are pretty similar. 20% down is kind of like these Fannie or Freddie type loans. And as a result, they typically have some of the best interest rates. They're backed by the government, but man, are they difficult to get kicked off and to qualify for. Same with a local bank. If you're just going through a local bank and it's not technically backed by Fannie or Freddie, you're getting a very similar loan product. And these banks, they want tax returns and your W-2 income, your global cash flows across your entire operation, and they want you to have reserves on tap. And this can be good for a clean, stabilized deal, but I don't think it's good for first-time investors. It doesn't allow you to be crafty or clever. And the reason I rank this as the trash strategy is that it is a very inefficient and slow method to buy properties. And the reason it doesn't work is because most people don't understand that they need to find a really, really good deal when they buy investment property. Whereas when you use the bank strategies, if the bank approves it, you probably just assume that it must be a good deal because why else would the bank approve it? And so by relying on the bank to do your filtering and underwriting for you, many beginners end up buying a property that doesn't really cash flow that well. All it does is pay you enough to pay the bank. And the good news here is we have much better options available to us that are less traditional, but give you a lot more flexibility as an investor. That's why I put this in the trash category. All right, moving on to the next strategy, let's pick up CMBS. And I would rank CMBS as trash as well. And so what this stands for, commercial mortgage-backed security. I used to use the term a lot, CMBS. So basically what happens is you can go to a local bank and you can qualify for a bank loan, and then they sell that loan product off to Wall Street. And so anytime you hear CMBS, that is where the note itself is being sold off to a third party, whereas when you do a traditional local bank, they tend to hang on to the note themselves and you service it directly with that local bank. And so that what that does is the terms can change a little bit between a local bank and CMBS. Either way, banks have this commercial loan officer set up, and those loans are not backed by Fannie or Freddie. These are not government-backed loans. And these loans are even worse than the 20% down Fannie and Freddie type loans. They usually require even higher down payments. They have slightly higher interest rates than the Fannie Freddie type loans. And the interest rate is only good for 3 to 5 years. Then the loan balloons, meaning that the loan comes due and you have to what they call recast the loan with the current market rates. And you usually go back to the same bank and get the new loan, but it's at the current market rates. So it gives you exposure to the risk of interest rate volatility. Whereas with the Fannie and Freddie type loans that are 20% down, they have fixed 30-year % interest rates. So those are good loans in the scheme of things, but it's just not good for most new investors. And so, because all these loans have higher risk, they have a very complicated loan approval process. They're more appropriate for established investors that are in a much better position and know how to underwrite deals. And this is kind of the best option available to them. I just don't recommend this as your first deal. Okay, now moving on to flipping houses. So, as a house flipper, where do we rank in this category for beginner? So I'd put that in the C category. We all know what this one is. Like from watching HGTV shows, you buy a house, you fix it up, you do some rehab to it, and then you list it on the market and you flip this house, right? And I really don't recommend this flipping houses, and you're just really good at finding and valuing discounted properties that need rehab, and you really enjoy the process of managing contractors to get the properties fixed up. If you love that process, it can make sense for you. And so I just don't find this to be a good place for most new investors to begin, because learning to buy right at a huge discount and know how to figure out what the rehab cost is going to be and actually get it done in time using contractors and then getting the property ready to list on the open market is a skill that most people just don't have, and I think takes quite a while to learn. Now, that is not to say that it can't work or it doesn't work. There are plenty of people who make money doing this. It's just not what I would suggest for most beginners unless you're really good at already fixing up properties and you really just like doing that. It's just something you enjoy doing and you want to see yourself as a house flipper for the rest of your life. Go forth and conquer. For most people, it's a means to an end, and I think there's just better ways to skip past it. All right, moving on, let's talk about some financing options, which is hard money. Now, hard money is when you get a short-term loan from an investor, and it's often used to flip houses, and maybe even doing the BRRRR method we'll talk about next. Short-term bridge loans like this are typically pretty expensive, but they can be used to do a quick repositioning strategy, and they typically have very high rates, and you got to pay points. They're so expensive. So you need a real plan to be able to pull this off. These are a little easier to qualify for than some of these loans down here, but it really helps if you have a specific strategy in mind and you're really confident in your exit strategy, because you don't want to get into a short-term loan and then get stuck and not have a good exit strategy, which is why I typically don't recommend this as a beginner, because it kind of goes hand in hand with some of these other more complex flipping or BRRRR strategies. And I'd rather just you not take that risk if you don't have. The good part about hard money loan is that they're fast. So if you have a good strategy, you have a good deal in your hands, and the only way you can raise the capital is to raise it from hard money, and you have a good deal, then the reason they call it hard money is because the lender looks more at the property versus you. They only roughly look at your experience, and they typically want you to have a little bit of experience. There are some hard money lenders that will work with absolute newbies, but they sometimes will not work with a newbie. Even still, hard money can be a good strategy if you're on the newer side and you really have found an amazing deal. But overall, I just wouldn't recommend it. All right, moving on to the next method, we'll talk about the BRRRR method. So if you haven't heard of the BRRRR method before, I'll put it in the C category and explain why. So the BRRRR method was coined by BiggerPockets, and it basically means you buy, you rehab, you rent the property out, you refinance it back out, and then you repeat the process. And the idea that is everything lines up. When you buy a property using the BRRRR method, then you basically get all your money back out. You can get into a deal because you bought it so low, you fixed it up, you forced appreciation, you rehab the property and make it better, you rent it out, and then you refinance and pull most, if not all, your money back out. And when it works, it's pretty amazing. The problem is right now, the way interest rates are, it's really hard to pull this off. And many times what you're doing here is you're using like a hard money loan to buy it on the front end. And then as you rehab it and get it fixed up, you then refinance it with typically longer term financing like these down here. And so what you're basically doing is you're using two, what I consider largely inferior products to basically get into a property without any money. And when you can pull it off, it's actually not that bad. The challenge is in today's marketplace, the viability of it is questionable because it's just so hard to find a deal at a good enough price where you can actually pull it off. People are doing it. I'm not to say it can't be done, but as a newbie, I would not recommend it because there's a lot of moving parts. In fact, my very first deal was a BRRRR method. I did the exact strategy, and I got lucky. Basically, I wasn't smart. I just got lucky. And looking back on it, I didn't realize how much risk I was taking, and I should have gone about it differently. Okay, let's move on to what we call agency debt. And so I'm going to put agency debt into, let's see, I'm going to put the agency debt also into the C category. And so agency debt is pretty similar to a 20% down type of product, except for it's kind of designed for multifamily or more stabilized commercial properties. And it's something that's used by people who are considered high net worth. And that's kind of the reason why I would put it down here. It is really favorable terms for multifamily and bigger commercial properties, but you have to have a significant net worth. They really like to see the sponsor, the person borrowing the money, to have some experience. So it's not ideal for a beginner. But when everything lines up, it actually works pretty well. It's one of the best loan products that you can get because you get a lot of the benefits of the 20% down terms, and it's backed by Fannie and Freddie, but you don't have to sign for it personally. There's no personal guarantee required, which I love. The downside of this is that you basically have to be qualified, and the process of getting approved for one of these things is one of the most painful bureaucratic processes I've ever been through, and I just kind of wouldn't recommend it for a beginner. Now, the only time it might make sense for a beginner is if you are already in a very strong financial position, you just happen to be new to multifamily. And if you have some cash and you can show a very strong balance sheet, like you have a high net worth and you have found a good deal, this could be one of the best ways to buy a property and hold it for 5, 10, 20 years using this exact type of loan. But most beginners are in that situation, so I would kind of categorize it down much lower on the list of Class C. Okay, let's move on to a DSCR, another loan product that I would also put in category C. And so DSCR stands for Debt Service Coverage Ratio, and it's basically also referred to as an asset-based loan. So they're looking at the asset and they intend for you to hold the property for the long term. So in contrast to the hard money, which is typically pretty expensive and it's short-term loans and they look at the hard asset. This is similar. They look at the hard asset and they look at you just a little bit, but they really look at the property, but they want you to hold it for the long term. And the interest rates here are typically a little bit higher than you might find from a commercial or traditional loan product. But in today's market environment, they're actually pretty competitive. They're not that much higher than bank loans. And they offer a 30-year fixed offer that the interest rate is fixed for the entire timeline, and they very much intend for you to hold the property. They do not want you to sell it. In fact, there's penalties if you sell the property within 5 years. And so this can be really good for stabilized Airbnb, stabilized 1 to 4 to 8 unit apartment complexes. This can be a good loan product. And the reason I put it lower down here is because the interest rates are high. It's expensive. And you're signing a institutional loan, which always comes with the risk of what happens if you can't pay it. And now the next category here is what I would call assumable financing. And I almost want to put it in the B category. But I'm going to actually keep it down here in the C category, and for one specific reason. When you take on assumable financing, you are still taking on the debt. You're qualifying for the debt, which means if you're not in a good financial position, you can't qualify it yourself. And so that's what puts me down here. However, it can be a good strategy to find some really good loans that are in place already that have very favorable terms. The reason I do like assumable debt is I can get interest rates that were from a couple of years ago. It's kind of like a cheat code. So what you do is you can target listings of properties that advertise that they have loans that are assumable, and they may have been bought in 2019, 2022, and your offer basically allows you to step into the position of the borrower. That means you got to qualify. That's the catch. You got to qualify. You got to be able to qualify for it. But if you can, then you could get some really favorable terms over the life of the rest of the loan. And the same downsides apply to this because you're dealing with the institution. You're assuming debt, so you're having to qualify. Now, you're still having to qualify for the loan and jump through all the same hoops that you would have to on these other types of loan products because this is a traditional loan product still. It's just you're stepping in to assume it. And so in that regard, I kind of keep it down here in the C category because it's just a pain and it's slow and it's a higher amount of friction. And the reason I like it though, the reason I consider maybe putting it up here is because it's such a viable option because there were a few years ago where interest rates were so low. And if you could lock that in, you're effectively buying this new financing and taking over the property. Okay, this next one might surprise you. All cash. Where would you put all cash? Well, I would actually put all cash in the B tier. The reason I like this is because it's fast. The problem is it ties up your capital and often lowers your return because you're not using kind of leverage. But for your first deal, I prefer to keep cash in kind of like my operations and reserves. But if you're in a strong position and that you have the ability to buy a property with cash, you're taking almost all the risk off the table. You're certainly taking debt risk off the table. And it's really hard to not cash flow on a cash flowing property if you buy it with all cash. I've actually bought properties. My IRA basically bought a property, and those things just cash flow like a freight train because I have no debt. The expenses are so low compared to the rents. Of course, the major caveat here is that you have to have the cash. And if you're new, you may not have the cash. But maybe if you just sold a property or you maybe exited a small business or you have a retirement fund that you can put into a self-directed IRA or you have a solo 401k, it can be a really low risk way of getting access and control of property without taking on the additional headaches and risks of taking on the debt that I'm talking about down here. All right, the next one I'm going to cover is what I call the split note. And this one is fairly complicated, which is the reason I might even think about even putting it down here because it's so complicated. But when I explain it, you might understand. So most people never go about asking for this because they don't know they can. So what you do is you get a bank loan for the first position, and then you get a second position seller financing note where the second position is behind the first position. So it's also referred to as a subordination loan, where you get a bigger loan from the bank, and then you get a second position in the seller. So you do seller financing on top of bank financing. And so oftentimes you're not coming up to the table with hardly any cash, maybe a little bit, but very little cash. The equity of the seller financing is in second position, and you're paying that off globally with cash flows. Now, the challenge with this strategy is that the bank who's in first position has to approve or allow for there to be a sec behind it. And I find that local traditional banks and like commercial banks or local credit union type banks, they are the most likely ones to say yes. Most of these other institutional type bigger outfits, they're not going to allow it, but the local banks might. And now across these two loans, you got to make sure that your coverage ratio is globally going to be okay. So you have to find a really good deal, get a bank loan for 50, 60% of the property, and then have another 20, 30% behind it for the second. And after you make both the mortgage payment to the bank and the mortgage payment to the seller, you still have enough cash flow that the property makes sense. And so this is why I say it's kind of complex. You got to make sure you understand it. But if you can get those things to line up, you can get into a deal with a very small amount of cash and then get the experience of managing and running a property. And this works best when the property is stabilized and the seller is really motivated by the price or taxes that they can versus getting all cash. You need a seller who's going to be cooperative and is a good dance partner. Just know this is a bit of an advanced topic for a beginner. Okay, the next one we're going to cover is Airbnb. So you probably know what that is. It's where you basically furnish a property and you rent it to people needing either shorter term stays or like traveling professionals. And you can fund it using any of these financing mechanisms that I've talked about already. And I actually own 3 units myself that we run through Airbnb. We use what we call midterm rentals where we rent it for 30 days or longer, but we could also do short-term rentals where it's like a nice nightly stay kind of. So in my case, on my Airbnbs, one of the properties is a duplex and it has a commercial local bank offering behind it, a loan behind it. And then the other property, we have a DSCR loan on it. And so you can fund this however you like. But basically, the downside of this is you're running a small business. You're in the hospitality business, and you're not really running a traditional real estate business that you can make more passive. Running an Airbnb is anything but passive. And the other hang up here is that you need capital to, for one, buy the property. And then two, you need the capital to furnish the property, fix it up, and get it in a good enough condition so that people want to stay there for the short term, right? You got to buy the beds and the silverware and the towels and all the things. But it can be a viable strategy, but you're really running a business. And so there's nothing wrong with it. It just takes a lot more time. In fact, what we do is we have a younger investor who manages our midterm rentals. We pay her 15% of the collected rents, and then she handles all the management back and forth through Airbnb, the communication, the messaging. If there's anything that happens, an emergency, there's a phone call, she takes it. That way, my wife and I just basically pay for stuff, and we're not really involved in the day-to-day. We check when someone leaves. If the cleaners did a good job, my wife will restock a few things and make sure the place is continuing to be nicely decorated. But most of the day-to-day operations fall onto our manager that we pay 15% of collected rents. It's not really a bad way to go as a strategy, but the Airbnb regulations have made it harder to get things done now. You have to get like licenses in a lot of places. And there's also kind of an oversaturation. And so I would really double check if this is something you really want to do as a beginner before going all in, spending a bunch of money on furnishings. And preferably, I would just buy the property using creative financing methods from one of the higher tiers you're going to hear about in a second if you insist on doing Airbnb. All right, so now we're getting into the creative stuff, and I would put subject to the existing mortgage into category A. So if you're not familiar with this is a creative real estate strategy where you buy a property subject to the existing mortgage, and basically the seller's mortgage stays in place. The title transfers, the ownership transfers, there's a deed, and you as the investor become the legal owner of the property, but the mortgage of the seller stays in place, and you just agree to make the payments. And the reason this works is if the seller is motivated, they got a problem, they really want out, and they just need some sort of solution, and they can't sell the property otherwise. And so if they're behind on payments, the property needs some work, or they just need to move quickly for whatever reason, and they need a creative solution, you might be that creative solution. So you're not having to qualify for a bank loan, which is good because in case you don't have good credit or your situation is just such that qualifying for a bank loan is a problem, then you don't have to because you're taking on the responsibility of paying somebody else's. And the reason this works is if the seller has a really low interest rate, you can basically inherit that property instead of going out into the marketplace and qualifying for the current market rate might be 6 or 7%. It also allows for a very fast closing because you're not having to waiting on any approvals. So it can make the deals go really fast if the seller needs that. Now, there are definitely some risks and some complexities with owning properties subject to the existing mortgage. There's this concept of the due on sale clause, which means the bank has the right to call the loan due. And if they do, they have every right to do so, and you got to pay it off. This doesn't happen a lot in practice, but it is a possibility. And also, you're taking on a lot of responsibility on behalf of the seller. So if you stop paying for whatever reason, you could hurt the seller's credit, and they could cause a problem for them. And that's not your intention, right? You're trying to solve problems for them. And so if you are going to buy this property, you better make really sure you're in a position to be able to make that payment no matter what. And really, anytime I'm going into a property subject to the existing mortgage, I really want a planned exit strategy. This is not the best strategy for a long-term hold. I still hold sub-2 properties, and I've been paying for 10 plus years. But it's usually best paired with some sort of strategy where you're going to do some sort of exit on the back end, and you're going to get out of the property in the future. Like within 5 years, do you plan on being out of the property? Then that's probably where sub-2 tends to make sense. In fact, you can even do it for flipping houses. So let's say you want to flip a house, then you could buy the property with their mortgage in place, make the payments for 6, 8, 12 months, however long it takes. And then at the end of it, when you flip the house and you're ready to put it on the market, then you can sell it and cash out and then pay off their mortgage. Of course, the benefits here is oftentimes you can buy the property without a lot of cash. And so if you're in a situation where you're just trying to get creative and get a hold of some properties, sub-2 can be a viable strategy for newbies. The downside is it's a bit complicated. And so you want to make sure you understand all the paperwork it requires to get the sub-2 done properly. Okay, the next one I'll talk about is a private money loan. This one right here. A private money loan is when you talk to a individual and they are willing to lend you their money for a return, and you get a loan from a private party. So it's very similar to a hard money loan, except for it's coming from a person and not from a company. So it's typically based on a relationship that you have with this private party. And the terms typically are fairly negotiable, whereas you really can't negotiate with a hard money lender very well, but you can with a private money lender. And it's often a very easy and fast way to get a proof of funds in the marketplace. And so this is typically a much shorter term arrangement, but they could extend between 2 to 5 years. I certainly have some that have gone is that long, but they knew it was going to go that long on the front end. So in many cases, you can combine a private money loan with some of these other financing strategies. So you can get a private money loan on top of a seller financing strategy, do some light rehab, and then flip the property or refinance it into longer term debt. The reason I rank it up here above some of these other ones is that it's easy to qualify for, right? Because it's a person and not an institution. And you can be pretty flexible with it because you can be as flexible as the private money lender allows you to be. So that actually brings us nicely to the next one, which I call the joint venture, which I would also put in the A category, the A tier. And it's very similar, is that you're talking to a private party, but instead of doing a loan, you're doing a joint venture where you're going in on the deal together. And the reason this can work is that you can basically combine forces with somebody else who has capital, and maybe you want to do the work. And so you split the equity with a partner, and you offer to find the deal, you offer to do most of the management, and then you all agree to make decisions together. And the big distinction here is they can lose money. Whereas with a private money lender, you owe them the money kind of regardless. If you can't make them the payments, then you got to keep making the payments, the interest payments, until you do pay them back, because they have a loan, like you've borrowed the money and they expect to get a return. Now with a joint venture, they're going in with you as equity. And so they could lose their money, and they probably will get a higher return as a result of taking on that risk. But I actually prefer joint ventures because that way, if you lose money, then they took on that risk with you, and you got to plan for things sometimes not going as you hoped they would. And if something doesn't go shake out as expected, then you're not on the hook for money that you don't have money to pay for. Basically, what you're doing is you're exchanging your time and energy and hustle for a chance at making a return. And if you lose money, then the capital partner loses money based on y'all's agreement. All right, the next strategy I'll refer to is wholesaling. Wholesaling. So you probably know what this is, but wholesaling is when you negotiate an amazing deal on a property and you get a really good price or really great terms, and then you market that contract to a third-party end buyer, and they basically take your position in the contract and you earn an assignment fee. And you can so basically make money in the business without ever owning the property. And you can do this with really very little money out of your own pocket. You just hustle and make a bunch of phone calls and find deals, and then you assign your contract to a third party. One of the caveats now, though, is if you're wholesaling residential properties, you need to know your local laws. Several states like Oklahoma, Illinois, South Carolina, and probably a few others have put in strict laws that make it largely impractical to wholesale residential properties. Now, for commercial properties, which is what I tend to focus more on these days, you can still wholesale them because it's much more of a buyer beware environment. But obviously, you need to check with an attorney in your local area to understand your local state laws. And the reason wholesaling is in the A tier is a great place to start to learn the business from kind of all the angles. You got to kind of learn every part of the business in order to successfully wholesale. And so you use your hustle in order to get some assignment fees and make some money while you learn. And a very similar strategy is called novations, which I'll also put in the A tier. It's a little more complex, but also kind of similar. So a novation is when an existing contract is replaced with a brand new agreement. So novate just means to replace. And so unlike assignment fees where you step into the contract of the original party stays liable, with a novation, you completely release the original seller or buyer from their obligations and you substitute a new party in their place. And so investors often use novations, the structure of novations, to give them permission to list the property with an agent, and the investor takes the place of the seller in the agreement of the listing agreement. So you list the property publicly per the terms of the agreement. And the reason this works so well is you can make money without owning the property, and you can get the benefit of listing the property with an agent without having to actually own the property. Now, the way this works is you need to negotiate an amazing deal with a great price and have the owner give you the authority for you to enter into a listing agreement with the agent on their behalf. And so this works best with a property that doesn't need a lot of work because you don't want to buy a fixer upper, put a bunch of money into it, and not actually own the property. You really want a property that's ready to be listed or good enough to be listed. And because it's a bit more complicated, I would definitely recommend that you make sure you have a good understanding of the paperwork and that you're able to clearly explain how the strategy works to the owner. Okay, so now the next one is a master lease or a lease option. I'm going to refer to lease options and master lease kind of in the same category. So, what happens here is you can control the property with a lease, improve the operations, and give you the choice of buying the property later. This can be the fastest path to your first deal because you can start operating the asset without having to qualify for a bank loan or even figure out financing at all because you're not really buying the property, you're leasing the property. So what you do here is you negotiate a multi-year master lease with an option to purchase the property in the future. And what it does is you tie the purchase price to a reasonable cap rate on a current or improved net operating income. So the catch here is that you must have the authority to collect rents and operate the business, handle repairs, and then sublet the property. So you're getting a lease on the property that gives you permission to sublet it to everybody else. And you're effectively now managing the property. The reason I like this is because you can learn the business while you're earning. And so what you're looking for here are assets where you can add simple value by managing it more effectively. You can fill vacancies faster. You can be better at fixing up and negotiating better leases. You can do a utility bill backing strategy. There's a lot of things you can do to run a business more effectively. And the owner maybe just wants out and they don't really want to sell yet, but they want to get rid of the property in the future and they want to get rid of the responsibilities of management. Okay, we're down to the last two. Okay, so one of my favorite ways to buy properties is seller financing, also referred to as owner financing. They mean the same thing. And this is where you can buy the property from the seller and you agree to make them payments over time. So instead of paying them the entire purchase price at closing, you give them a small down payment and then you make them installment payments over time, which saves them on taxes and lowers your risk of getting into the property so you can get into the property with a low down payment. And the reason I like this so much is because I like to negotiate with a person versus institutions. People tend to be much more flexible, and when they are motivated, they want to solve the problem now. And so there are a lot of boomers who are retiring right now, and many of them own these small businesses and real estate properties free and clear, and they care about not paying a bunch of taxes and they want to get rid of the management of the property and they just want to move to Florida and retire. They're over it. And you can step in and offer to buy the property at their sales price without qualifying for a bank loan. And so it's a perfect environment for you to make offers to sellers and let you skip all these lower tier options altogether. And so what I do in this case is I target small multifamily, RV parks, single family portfolios, even storage facilities, and they've owned the properties for 10 years or longer typically because now they have a lot of equity in the property. And so I give them a 3-option letter of intent where I give them a really low cash out price, and then I give them their price with owner financing terms. And I find that giving that option to them gives them the choice to choose between a couple different choices, one really low cash offer or one their price, my terms. And so just like a bank, we're going to record the mortgage so that their position is secured and you use an escrow servicing company. And so it's very clear on who's paying taxes and insurance and who's taking care of the maintenance. And you always want to verify with the seller that they truly own the property free and clear, but you do that through a normal title search like every other type of closing. And so what you're doing here is you're buying a stream of income and you're letting the seller be the bank, which makes it so perfect. Now, the last one I'll talk about, and really is kind of the best way for a new investor to get started in the business, is a thing called house hacking. So if you haven't heard of house hacking, it's where you buy a property, you live in part of it, and you rent out the rest of it to offset or even completely cover your housing costs. So a common setup here is you buy a duplex, a triplex, or a quadplex. You live in one of the units, and then you rent out the other units so that pays for all your expenses. And if it works out correctly, You can also do this with a single family home where you're renting out bedrooms or maybe your basement, or if you have what they call an ADU, an auxiliary dwelling unit behind your house, you can rent that out and it's supplemental income. And now your housing is paying for your housing. And so the amazing outcome here is that you have your tenants cover all your living expenses. They cover your property taxes, your insurance, your mortgage, and utilities even. And so when everything lines up, you basically have your housing paid for, which is most people's biggest expense. And this is actually something that I did, not really even knowing what it was called. I bought a house. I had a couple of roommates and they paid me rent for my second and third bedroom. And as a result, they covered most of my mortgage. They didn't cover my entire mortgage, but if I had known what I was doing and I was a little smarter at the time, I would have bought a fourplex. I would have done that every year until I got married. So, as a beginner, this can be one of the absolute best strategies to set yourself up for life. In fact, there's a really good book titled Set for Life that was written by Bigger Pockets that talks about this very strategy. The catch here is that you have to be flexible in your living situation. You have to be willing to move or have a roommate or manage properties that are adjacent to you with tenants all around you. And what's really cool about this strategy is you can use some of these FHA type loans where you're putting that like 3% down or 5% down on a property and you get 30-year fixed financing, or you can use seller financing. You can find one of these properties, buy it seller financing, use the best of both worlds, do house hacking and live in the property, rent out the available spots and have your housing pay for your housing, which is everyone's biggest expense. And so basically you can make bank without having to use the banks. And what's really cool about this is you can keep doing it. You can do it, live in the property for a year, and then every year you move into another place and you get another 5% down loan from Fannie Mae or something. Now, one caveat to think about if you're doing this and you're using these 20% down or traditional bank loan options, make sure you're not performing what they call mortgage fraud. So you want to read the details of the loan product that you're getting and make sure that whatever you're doing is compliant with what the loan product allows you to do. So for example, if you're supposed to live in the property and you claim you live there, but you never actually moved in, then that's loan fraud. And you do not want to do that. You do not want to mess with the feds. These are federal programs and this is not a place to cut corners. So follow the rules, do it right. And like with any of these strategies, you're going to have to shop around and find a good situation where the property makes sense for your situation and can get a loan product that qualifies for what you want to do. I know it's a lot, but how do you go about picking the strategy? So here's a 60-second breakdown on how to do that. So do you want to skip the banks and get your first deal and you're super limited on cash, but you want to own the property? Then you want to do something like owner financing. If you want to generate cash and learn the business, you can do things like wholesaling or novations or master leases. If you want to learn how to own the property and have time to act as the manager, the master lease is the best way to do that because you actually get experience running properties. If you want to own property and you do have cash and you do feel comfortable raising capital from other people, you can use things like private money in combination with JV and owner financing to make some amazing deals. Then you just walk your way down these deals until you find the debt option that helps you buy the properties and that allows you to cash flow the way you need to. So your next steps here are to pick one physical geographic market, pick one type of asset class, and pick one strategy that makes sense for you. Spend one focused hour per day on direct outreach, trying to find brokers and sellers who are willing to dance. Use their 3-option letter of intent example that I'm going to share with you and submit offers to every qualified seller. And then you underwrite these deals for cash flow on conservative income and expenses. And then you can close your first deal in the next 6 to 12 months. If this helped, you can join my free community to get your free commercial deal readiness score and my 3-option letter of intent template so that you know how to submit offers with confidence and pick the strategy on this tier list that makes the most sense for you.